Hey guys, it's Courtney, and today I am going to be using the Winter Hug stamp set by Simon Says Stamp. I'm just going to be using one of these images, just the snowman here. When I looked at this image, it kind of gave me like a vintagey feel, so that's how we're going to color this. So I have a piece of Neenah Desert Storm cardstock. This is cut to 4 1/4 by 3, and I am using my mini Misty here, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp this twice with Fade Out ink by Ink on 3. And then we'll move on to the Copic coloring. I am going to be using my Polychromos today, and I'm going to start off with the snow. Now, normally I would use cool grays for snow, but being I want to give this more of a vintage look, I guess you could say, I'm going to use some warm grays. So I'm going in with the warm gray 4 first, just to add my shadows. And all I'm really doing is adding shadows that are part of the image, where the snow would kind of be piled up a little bit in front of that snowman. I also added just a little bit of shading on either side. And I'm going to blend that out each time with the warm gray 3, 2, 1, and then I will bring in the white for pretty much just the middle area. I don't want too much white showing. My white is teeny tiny, and it kills me every time I have to sharpen it because it just keeps getting smaller and smaller. So once the snow on the bottom was done, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the snowman itself. And we're going to start with the 2 bottom sections of the snowman, not his face, his body. And I'm going to use the same color combination for this as well. Now, in this case, it's best to pick a light source, being you're going to have some shadows. So I'm just going to pick the top right as my light source. So a majority of my shadows are going to be on the left-hand side. So again, I'm going in with that warm gray 4, and there's some like dash lines within the image, and that will just add some texture to the snowman. So I'm going over those. I'm also adding a shadow underneath his scarf and on the left-hand side of where his scarf is hanging over his body. Also, where the 2 sections of the snowman would come together, I'm kind of adding like a little V. And each time I blend that out with the lighter gray they're not markers, gray pencils, I'm just going to extend that V out a little bit further, and this will make it look as if there is multiple sections to this snowman. Now, as I was coloring his little buttons, I didn't want to color over his buttons because I'm using Fade Out ink, and that disappears pretty much when you color over it. So I'm going to go in with a pen, and as far as I know, you could probably use any pen here, but I just took my EK Success journaling pens, and I'm going to fill those in solid. That way I don't lose them and I don't forget to go back in and fill them in. So I'm moving down with the gray pencils again, just like I did with the snow, extending those shadows out each and every time. Once I get to the warm gray 2, that's when I'm going to add a little bit of shading to the right-hand side. Even though my shadows should be to the left, the snowman is still a round object. So they are going to have a little bit of shading on either side, but I didn't use my darkest pencils for that shading on the right-hand side. So once I get down to the warm gray 1, I'm going to finally move on to the white pencil, and there I go, having to sharpen it. My heart is breaking. And so I'm just going to go ahead and fill that entire area in for those highlight areas and kind of just get all of those grays to blend together. Now I'm going to pretty much do the same thing for the snowman's face. However, I wanted to fill in his face first. So I'm going to start with the carrot, his carrot nose. And I'm only using 2 different colors here, and they are orange-ish, but they're more of like a burnt orange because I want to stay with that color scheme, the darker, more earth tones. So I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to the bottom portion and little dash lines for the texture within the carrot, and then fill that in with the lightest color. Again, going to bring in another EK Success journaling pen and fill in his little eyes and his mouth so that I don't lose them once I do my coloring. So for his face or his head, I'm going to use those same warm gray markers, and this time the shadow is going to be underneath where his hat is kind of hanging over his face, and I'm just going to bring that shadow down just a little bit towards the left-hand side, and each and every time I'm just extending that a little bit further. And then once again, finishing off with that white pencil, filling in the rest of it, kind of blending everything together. Now we're going to move on to our browns. And I'm pretty much using the same color combination for the rest of it. So I'm going to start off with my darkest brown, and I'm going over his arms. And I'm going with a very, very heavy hand. So if you go in with a heavy hand, you're not going to blend these colors out, which I don't want them to blend out. I want them to just be there. So I went in with a heavy hand first so that I don't lose them once I finish my coloring. And that way that color won't blend in with the scarf. So the scarf has stripes on it. So for this first brown combination, I am just going in and adding a little bit of shading where the scarf would kind of be tucked in underneath his face, and the parts that are hanging down, I'm just adding a little bit of shading off to the left-hand side. And I'm using 4 different browns here. And quite honestly, I didn't get a whole lot of contrast. These browns are very similar, but I am going in with a fairly light hand. And once I'm happy with the blending or with the color combination, once I get to that lightest color, I can go in with a heavier hand over the entire thing, get all of those colors to blend, and they won't blend any further once you go in with that heavy hand. Once the paper has as much whatever your pencils are made of. Every pencil is a little bit different. I think these are oil-based. Prismacolor are waxed-based, I believe. I could be wrong, but I know they're different from one another, but they pretty much work the same. So finishing off with this lightest color here for that highlight area. Then for the other stripes, I'm going to use almost the same color combination, but this time I'm leaving off the darkest color, but I'm doing my shading the same exact way. So I am starting off with the darkest midtone, and then I'll go to the lightest midtone, then I'll go to the lightest color, and then I'm going to bring in another color that's even lighter, and honestly it's kind of yellowy, but it blends well together. So again, just doing my shading the same way here. Now, I don't know whether you guys can see on camera, but there's some lines where there would be some texture, or maybe where the scarf would have little folds in it. I did go over those lines with my darkest color for whatever section I'm coloring, and I didn't blend those out any further. I did go over it with the lightest color, but that way it will kind of look as if there's some texture within that scarf. So I'm just finishing off here with the lightest color for these remaining sections here. I did have to go back in for that one little section with that lightest midtone because I was not getting a good blend, and just extend that out a little bit further. Now for his hat, he also has stripes on his hat. Oh, first I went in for this little fringy area on his scarf, and I'm going in with that darkest color, making sure that my pencil is super sharp, and I'm just filling them in. I'm probably not going directly over the lines within the image because honestly, I can barely see them at this point, so I'm just making it up as I go along. So for the hat, it does have sections or stripes on it, just like the scarf does, but I don't want to do that. I want this to be solid. So I'm using the lighter brown combination that I used for the scarf, and I am just going to go over everything. So I'm adding my shading more off to the left-hand side. Also where it kind of folds down, that's also going to have some shading to the left-hand side. And there's a little crease right on the top, and I'm just extending that crease out each and every time with just like a flick line. Now I'm going directly over these little stripes in the hat, and being I'm using fade out ink, you'll never see it once the coloring is done. That's the great thing about the fade out ink. No matter what medium you're using, those lines literally disappear, and it's more forgiving because nobody will ever know that you made a mistake if you make a mistake. So I'm just finishing off here with the lightest color for the highlight area, and for the bottom portion of the hat and the little tip of the hat, the pom-pom I think it's called. Normally this would be white, and I started off by using these warm grays for the white, but realized this is probably going to blend in way too much with the snowman itself. I don't want to use the same exact colors. So I did add a little bit of shading to the bottom portion of the hat on either side with those warm gray marker or warm gray pencils. But I'm going in with a very, very, very light hand. I'm going to take that lightest pencil that we used for the hat, and I'm going in with a super, super light hand. You can see that my pencil's kind of tipped off to the side, and I'm just adding just a bit of color, then adding that white pencil over it to kind of tone it down a little bit. That way it doesn't look exactly the same as my snowman. So once my coloring is all complete, I wanted to add some color to the background. So at first I tried the Weathered Wood Distress Oxide ink. It was way, way too gray. So I ended up bringing out my white pigment ink by Hero Arts, the Unicorn White Pigment ink, which I love using around Christmas time, any white pigment ink. And I just started blending that towards the top, or from the top towards the bottom. And I really don't care if I go over my snowman because I'm going in with such a light hand and it's such a little amount of ink that I don't think it would make too much of a difference. And the snowman is pretty much white anyway, so it's not a big deal. But as I was adding this color, I tried to blend and blend and blend, and it blended. With the pigment ink, it stays wet for a while, so you have time to blend it, but I really wasn't liking it. It just was too white. I didn't want too much white. I just wanted to add a little bit of color to the background. So in order to kind of tone this down or tone the white down, I am going to go ahead and bring out Antique Linen Distress Oxide ink and another blending buddy brush. And I'm going over this very lightly. I'm tapping off on my scrap piece of paper so I don't have too much ink, but this will tone down that white, and that white won't be quite as bright. The antique linen is almost the same color as the cardstock, so it will tone down the white, or kind of just not so bright. So next I'm going to take some of the little snowflakes that are in the stamp set and bring back out that white pigment ink. Now this is very hard to see on camera. It's very, very subtle. I didn't want these to kind of take over. I wanted them to be very subtle in the background, and I just kind of scattered those around, but I am leaving the top portion with nothing on it, and this will be for my sentiment. I did also stamp some of these snowflakes off the paper just so that it kind of gives more of a seamless pattern. So once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and adhere this to a piece of white cardstock that is cut just a teeny tiny bit larger than this panel itself. Then I have another piece of Neenah Solar White, nope, I lie, Neenah Desert Storm, that is cut just a little bit smaller than an A2 size card, and that will go on my card base. Now, a little tip for you. Do you see how my edges on my card base are a little frayed? This happens sometimes when you score it. If you go in with a sand eraser with a very light hand and kind of buff that out, you won't be able to see it. So this is going to go right here in the center, but first I need my sentiment. Now I added all this pigment ink in the background, so I'm going to test out this area, and you can see that it's still very, very wet. So I did have to let this sit for about 10 minutes or so before I was able to add my embossing powder. This will stick everywhere where that ink is still wet. So once that was dry, I did go ahead and treat this with my anti-static tool, and then I'm going to go ahead and stamp out my sentiment with my Versamark ink. And you can see finally I got a new Versamark ink pad. Mine was so disgustingly dirty. I finally splurged and bought a new Versamark. Went ahead and stamped that right there on the top portion of my little scene there, sprinkling on some white embossing powder and making sure that my heat gun is nice and heated up, being I have adhesive on the back of this panel. Going to go ahead and heat set that, and then I'm going to go ahead and assemble everything together. So I'm going to adhere my Neenah Desert Storm card panel, the large panel, to an A2 top folding note card with my Tombow Mono Multi Glue. I'm putting some fun foam on the back of my smaller panel, my little scene there, and that will go directly in the center. And that is it. Super simple today, guys. I know that I was supposed to have a video yesterday. I am still waiting on the final package of my Christmas stamps and dies that I still haven't received. If you guys don't know, we had like a blizzard yesterday, so it kind of halted everything. So this was kind of a last minute one, but it's up, and I promise I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks, guys. Bye.